I think this will absolutely help with running the pathway with multiple different things. It'll help us with the living out. I heard from a guy who he calls himself a decision scientist. I guess that's an actual profession out there. He's a decision scientist and disciple maker, and he was talking about the living out aspect. As a decision scientist, he said if you don't act on something within 72 hours, then the chances of you actually doing something drop to almost zero. So there's your perspective from a decision scientist that might be helpful as we're being incarnational after tonight, and as we're helping others be incarnational. If they're struggling living out from disciple maker's pathway, from a discipleship time, from a discovery Bible study. So how can we help people with living out the way Jesus lived out the mission? And that's incarnational mission. Next time we'll be talking about how we can posture ourselves after Jesus in his proximity to people, what he proclaimed to people, the presence he took with people, his powerlessness before people, and just talk about how we can imitate those rhythms in our life as well. But first, the theology and the why behind what we do. A few quotes from Caesar Kalinowski. He says, living out is where all this meets the real world. Living out is the natural and deliberate process of living among, listening to, and loving people in culture. Loving people in culture with the desire to connect them to our Christian community as we learn to live the missional and incarnational way. We soon are faced with challenges to our daily living. As we learn to live out the gospel, we grapple with the bottom line issue of our willingness to take responsibility for our relationships with others, and whether we'll let the mission of God dictate the purpose and schedule of our lives. Inside the tension of living out are our own ambitions, our faith, our fear, and our frailty. It's where the rubber meets the road on the lifestyle we always talk about as disciple makers. The challenge that many of us face is the living out. We got the Sunday morning part down, and we can gather there and fellowship, but discipleship is what's needed for that living out throughout the rest of the week. So I hope this lesson will bridge that gap between the Sunday morning and the living out. There's a quote I heard over a year ago now, and here's the quote: "There are ways of doing church that you haven't even begun to imagine." And that just set my mind racing, and probably blowing up my church every other week after reading a new how-to book on the mission or on church. But as we talk about the incarnational way, it's not really even reimagining church. It's reimagining what it looks like to follow Jesus and just be a disciple of Jesus. Imagining what Jesus would do in your context. So that's a question that sets, or a quote that sets my imagination on fire. And I hope that's something to even bring up as we disciple others and setting their imagination on fire. So if we were to start with the church, quick definition of church, you might begin to speak about it this way with people. Church is ecclesia in Greek. It's correctly defined as the called out. When you look at the Greek word, it's a political term, but it simply means a body of people called out for a select purpose. So whether it was political or not, it's for some select purpose. It could have been as simple as, hey, we want to build a gate around the city, and so we are going to put together a church, an ecclesia, a little committee, and they're going to figure out how to build the gate. So it's not just a gathering of people, and it's not just church for church's sake. It's called out for a purpose. So if you're going to go about reimagining church, you need to think about that purpose and get your mind around that purpose, because we are the gathering of the called out ones. We know we have this purpose to bless the wider community, to make disciples, to love and glorify God, that our purpose is not just for ourselves. We have this purpose to look towards the edges of the kingdom, to see where it's not, and bring the kingdom there. And to release the people of God to fulfill their calling in that as well. But it takes a lot to do that, and a lot to leverage that, even a lot to imagine that beyond the Sunday morning. So to define mission then, throw out another definition here. Mission comes from the Latin, mission meaning I send. It is the task on which the church is sent into the world. And you might be saying, well, that's Latin. The Bible wasn't written in Latin. Very true. So the Latin term missio, which means I send, is actually a translation of the Greek term apostello, where we get the term apostle. It becomes translated into our modern day English word mission, or sent, or purposed. And I think that etymology behind the word is important. So then we got to ask, what does it mean to be missional, or to have mission, or to go on a mission? And I've made extreme mistakes on either side of the spectrum, where sometimes I define mission too narrowly. And when it's too narrow, it can really frustrate the church because they feel like they're failing to fit into a narrow definition or to live up to one mode of being missional, like say cold contact campus evangelism. I'm like, yeah, I got out there on campus, I did this, I did that. Or right now with my church, I think it's inspiring them. I've shared about doing the Redmond Food Project and just collecting food from neighbors. But that's not something that everyone is able to do, so I shouldn't only define mission in that way. And if I did go on only defining mission through, say, cold contact evangelism, then people would really disconnect from me. And I wouldn't be able to figure out all the other ways of doing mission that would actually help people to do mission if they can't get on campus to evangelize. So I've actually done this incarnational mission lesson with a few other evangelists in my region, and they admitted they had a lot to grow in this area, as I have a lot to grow in this area, and that our fellowship does very well at certain modes of mission, but mission for marrieds, mission in a neighborhood, mission in so many other contexts, we haven't figured it out. We've barely scratched the surface, and Incarnational, I think, can help us to do that. Opposite side of the spectrum, we could define mission too broadly, where somehow everything mysteriously becomes mission, and to the point where we're not doing mission at all. Went to the dog park and said hi to the dogs, so I really fulfilled the mission of God. And you can hear things that bizarre because somehow everything becomes mission. And to an extent, yes, everything is spiritual and we shouldn't put up barriers, but we also need to define it in a concrete way and have some balance in between those extremes. So let's eliminate both extremes, unpack how we perceive mission, and define it further so that you can actually practically embody it as a church. I've been around with this with our church body here in Bend for a couple of hours, just coming up with a definition of mission. It's good to think about, but then you also have to embody it. All right, so to get us thinking, I'll share a couple of deep theological quotes. This is from Leslie Newbegin. He says, "Mission means proclaiming the kingdom of the Father, sharing the life of the Son, and bearing the witness of the Spirit." I like it. Then from David Bosch, here's another one. It says, "Mission is a passage over a boundary between faith in Jesus and its absence." And one more from Bosch. "There's a boundary-breaking dimension. Apostles, missionaries, sent ones always look to jump the fences of this world to witness to the extension of God's glory." For you guys, what definition would you throw out for mission? Or what's something about the three that I just threw out that you appreciate or find interesting? Often, mission can get obscured and shaped, and our imagination of what mission can be gets captured and bolted down by evangelistic, attractional mission. That's kind of the dominant American form, attractional church. To define that a bit, it might be get somebody to Sunday morning and then win them by the attraction and the great worship and the crowd, and my pastor's expert sermon, and then my pastor will do the disciple making, and that's mission. I'll just get somebody to my pastor because he knows what he's doing. For a lot of people, that's how they define it. I think for many of us as disciples, we know it's a bit more than that, and we have a part to play. But that's a dominant form of mission in our society. Others even call it the Christendom template. That's not really how they did it in the first century, but that's what came aboard during Christendom. So the Christendom template tends to bolt down missional, the sent ones, and the sending. When we think of that, the missio, the Latin and the Greek, the apostello, which means sent one, that tends to be bolted down when it's evangelistic, attractional mission only, because it relies mostly on exclusively getting people to an attractional approach. There's a church down the road that has their big Halloween event, pumpkin patch. There's one church that rented a whole park, and they're bringing in 1,000 pumpkins to drop for their people. So, another church is live music, and they got the corn maze and tens of thousands of dollars into these harvest or Halloween events. That's attractional mission. That's great. The thing about that is it's only going to appeal to a smaller and smaller portion of our society. And then we're really just fighting over the same 30 or 40% of Christians who are going to go to an attractional style event like that. It's the incarnational mission then that helps us lean into the other 60 or even 70% of people and how we can reach them, how we can be the sent ones to them, to go and be rather than come and see. So it doesn't have to be an either or, but certainly we shouldn't neglect one of the contexts for the other. The legacy, traditional Christendom form of church, it's actually really good for doing what it's designed to do. It harvests the low-hanging fruit, the people who are going to look you up and come to you, and essentially they're going to be the missionary at the end of the day if that's what's happening. But that's great. That's what our Sunday mornings can sometimes be set up to do. But then it leaves us with no real vision or understanding or competency for the incarnational mission if we're only relying on that approach. And I think a lot of us have mastered that approach that's going to be a dwindling approach in the future. And then if we do lean into that approach, it has to be coming up with a better and better show to compete with other attractional churches. We have to have better programming, better services, better benefits, more effective marketing, better website, all of these things, which are great things. So enough about the attractional process. Let's get into incarnational. I'll skip forward in my notes. We all know the attractional because that's been the dominant form. Some have said, though, that by going incarnational, it goes from having a church-centered mission to a God-centered mission.
Amen.
So we're going to talk about the God-centeredness of it. And in being incarnational, it really is a recentering, recalibrating, ReJesusing. And I think that's what can be appealing to other people. This isn't just another way of doing church or ministry, but recentering on Christ. I often use that in our communion prayers on Sunday mornings now. Hey guys, let's just recenter and recalibrate on Jesus, because doing church will probably be the overflow of doing that. So John 1:14, that's where we get this word incarnational. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And I could speak volumes of how beholding God's glory revealed through Jesus Christ helps us to be transformed and to grow, and how we could imitate him. That's all important in this passage, but the Word became flesh is where we get our term incarnational. The Word incarnated itself. It put on flesh and bones and meat and became Jesus. The Eternal moved into the neighborhood and stepped out of time and space and pitched his tent in Jerusalem and took up dwelling there. That was his missional start, and that's our start. So if we're going to define mission apart from incarnational, then you lose this mode of how Jesus first went about his mission. And I think it's almost like separating an inseparable twin when we take the incarnational aspect out of the mission. So the root meaning of incarnation means this: any person or thing serving as the type of embodiment of a quality or concept. That's what it means, this putting on flesh, this being incarnational. And of course, in our context, it's in the way of Christ and embodying him, to put his flesh on, enter his mission to bring the kingdom of God. His way should be our way. His plan will work if we work his plan, if we emulate his methods. But here's where we can sometimes go wrong in that. Those who start with the question about the relationship to the existing church have already made a common and dangerous mistake. Start with the church and the mission will probably get lost. Start with the mission and it is likely that the church will be found. Often we start with, well, maybe we could do this to be missional and that to be missional. We go, well, people in my church really do this, or that's not the way we do things around here. And then we get all confused because of the way we might presently do church. So start with the mission, and you're going to end up finding the church after a while. In our pathway training, we have a section on reimagining church, and we don't really spell out different ways or methods of doing church. We talk about Jesus, we talk about disciple making, we talk about what it means to follow him, and a church expression will probably emerge from that when you apply that within your context. A missional, incarnational approach. So I'm working up to, I'm going to do a screen share of an image that's going to help us understand all of this, but a bit more theology before we get to this image that'll help us understand everything. When we approach mission in that way, Jesus is introduced into the imaginations and the conversations of local people in an evocative way. And discovering Jesus becomes as much about talking with Jesus about your neighbor next door. And figuring out what church looks like means talking to your neighbor next door to figure out what church looks like in your context. You know, you get more of the becoming things to all men. I have to ask myself, 4 years into a church planting, does our church look like the mission team that first arrived here and our culture that we have imported here? Or does it look more like the community around us? And which are we leaning into and how are we applying mission? There's a great quote that this can be recovered by seeing mission as an activity of God and not primarily as an activity of the church. That helps you to be God-centered rather than church-centered. I told our group just this morning, we don't really need to figure out, gee, should we do mission in this way or that way? It's mission that constitutes us being here in the first place and being a church. As fire exists for burning, we exist to do this mission for God. We get the privilege to participate in his purpose and not the other way around. Not fitting him into our definition of some way we already do church. So we want to mirror our engagement after the way we see Jesus engaging in the scriptures. There's so much to be learned right there. That's why we have scriptures all throughout our disciple makers pathway. And truth be told, in disciple making movements, which the pathway imitates, it is the missional incarnational approach that wins out time and time again, rather than an evangelistic attractional approach. That doesn't work. That's usually not even allowed in their context. So they have to imagine how to do church and mission this way. And missionaries really only find success when they pass on quickly to local people what church looks like in their context and let them own it rather than importing something. But back to the scriptures. So John 1, Jesus incarnates himself. John chapter 20, 21, Jesus says this. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." That's the Greek apostello right there, that we are sent ones. As the Father missioned me, I'm missioning you. So if Jesus came into the world in this incarnational way, or any other method that Jesus used, that's how the Father sent him, and that's how he is sending us. So the question then becomes not how do we do mission, but how does Jesus do mission? And that's really how we have to define it, imitate it, and look at it. All right, Jesus's way is our way then. Alan Hirsch, he employs the church with a quote that if we calibrate ourselves around mission that is determined by Jesus rather than the church, then we'll end up finding the church. This breaks it all down. All of those theological quotes I just shared. It really means that our ecclesiology, or the way we do church, should be determined by our missiology, or the way we do mission, which should be determined by our Christology, or the way Jesus did what Jesus does. So when we show up on a Sunday morning, or when we show up for mission, it should always be recalibrated by what we see Jesus doing. Church should be calibrated by mission, which should be calibrated by Jesus. Because then that's always putting on flesh. That's always incarnating and recalibrating and ReJesusing and recentering back to Him. And then you don't end up doing some weird form of mission or some weird form of church that isn't really Jesus-style disciple-making. And churches end up doing really weird things that aren't Jesus-style disciple-making. So don't start with how should we do church. Start with how did Jesus do Jesus and how did Jesus do mission, and let that calibrate the way we make disciples. Very helpful image for me that I keep going back to and keep going back to. It's an illustration for how churches can evaluate the way they do mission, recalibrate back to His mission, no matter how successful or unsuccessful we are. So the question is, how did Jesus do His mission? And here I want to quote Robert Coleman, and then I want to get into a few scriptures to really just look at Jesus and how He did mission. And then that'll be the end of our lesson tonight. So Robert Coleman and then some Jesus scriptures. Robert Coleman, of course, he wrote the Master Plan of Evangelism. Before I was born, I got to meet him though, and he's still alive, and he's still making disciples. And truth be told, I didn't meet him. I stood next to him, and I got to hear him pray, and I was like, oh my goodness, Robert Coleman, because he wrote the Master Plan of Evangelism, the gold standard of discipleship and disciple making. I love a quote that he's shared. Even now, today at 90 years old, he says, I learned something new about disciple making every single day. Because he's still living it and he's still discipling guys and focusing on a few. So go and read the Master Plan of Evangelism. Because that was actually Robert Coleman just looking at the ways and styles of Jesus. And it's been a staple in our movement of churches as well. But here's the interesting thing. In the updated version of Master Plan, Robert Coleman went back and he added a new chapter 1 to the Master Plan of Evangelism. If you remember the chapter titles in Master Plan of Evangelism, he talks about delegation and association and words that all rhyme together and have alliteration like that. So his new chapter 1 in Master Plan is incarnation. And he says, yeah, this was the missing ingredient for me all these years, and a missing ingredient from the Master Plan. So that tells us, all right, we need to listen to what incarnational is if Robert Coleman is talking about it. And here's a couple of lines of what Robert Coleman says, that Jesus became a servant. So if we're going to posture ourselves that way, we need to be servants. It's self-sacrificial love. It's cross-shaped actions for the benefit of others that proclaims the kingdom of God. That's how we manifest the kingdom of God as a church. So in our disciple makers pathway and in disciple makers movement, they emphasize things like bless rhythms, like compassion ministry, like the Shema lifestyle, where their loving actions for others allows others to experience the gospel before they ever even hear about the gospel. Robert Coleman says we must take on the servant's mantle. Wrap the towel around our waist and get on our knees right next to our Lord and wash people's feet and love people. He says that serving people brings opportunities to disciple them. So before he even gets to how you find a disciple and start discipling someone or make disciples,
He says you need to serve them to find opportunities to even get to that. It starts with the loving and serving and incarnating yourself the way Jesus did. His big point about the way Jesus did is simply that Jesus entered their world. He got into their world, he got into their life, spent time with them. So we must take the servant's mantle. We have some 50 Discovery Bible studies in the pathway on how to meet people at their pain point or their need and minister to them, or say, hey, let's do a study on that, so that you can serve them at their felt need. Robert Coleman says that seeking people in need is our responsibility. Thus, in the pathway, we have all of this study, so you can seek people in their need and take responsibility for them. Coleman says the shepherd goes after lost sheep, and so we have to go after lost sheep. I love that. I was talking with Brian Shirley the other week about life languages and how those come into play with the pathway. And I said, yeah, I think the pathway is too much the shaper language or the contemplator language, because I love it. And other people seem to struggle with it sometimes. And he said, oh, no. The pathway is all about the shepherd's heart. It's all about the responder life language. It's all about how to love people better. And he thought that shapers would actually be more resistant to it, because shapers have already shaped and do church the way they want to do church, and they don't want to be doing the pathway thing, was his thought. And maybe there's more to be hashed out there, but it is so true when we make it incarnational, when we posture ourselves after the shepherd's heart. That is responder language right there. So I hope he'll be on a future call to give us more life language advice on our discipleship and on the pathway. So here's a few postures of Jesus and scriptures on Jesus. It's great, even if you were to have a D time with this, with some other guy, or to go and do a lesson on this, you could just expand on these scriptures. It's where Jesus says, the Son of Man came. And truth be told, if you rearrange the word came, there's maybe 6+ references in the New Testament, but this is where it most concretely says the Son of Man came. And Son of Man itself, that appears like 60 times throughout the whole Bible. But the Son of Man came, we find some very good incarnational postures of Jesus. One of them is Matthew 16:13. Matthew 16:13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? So yeah, came is in the first sentence, and then who do you say the Son of Man is? And you see my point there. It starts with who do you say Jesus is, centering on him. And then right after this, he says, Peter, on this rock I will build my church, because you know that I am this Son of Man. And because you've been imitating me. And then an expression of church will emerge. But he doesn't start with, Peter, what do you think church should look like? He starts with, who do you say I am? Matthew 11:19, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, here's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds. That's a challenging posture of Jesus. Am I known as a friend of sinners? And that's a great mode of mission right there. Jesus came eating and drinking. Am I doing that to reach out to people? Luke 19:10, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. In context, that was him being very incarnational, going to meet with Zacchaeus, essentially doing a discovery Bible study with him, asking Zacchaeus questions, and then Zacchaeus says, yeah, I'm going to give away everything I have and do it for you, Jesus. And he enters his home. He breaks bread with him. He honors him. Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So it says why Jesus came, his postures. It gives us the mode of how he did mission. A few other great passages. This is one we use in the Disciple Maker's Pathway, Matthew 9:36-38. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Hey, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And it's amazing going through the pathway how many people we do a discovery Bible study on that passage, and their hearts are mobilized to be compassionate for others, to pray more, and to do mission the way we see Jesus doing mission in that passage. That's why I think those discovery studies are the most powerful part of the pathway. In John 4:34 through 35, my food, Jesus says, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. This isn't a Son of Man passage. This is just one where Jesus is even imitating the Father in this way. And as the Father has sent him, he is sending us. So Jesus says, don't you have a saying, it's still 4 months until harvest? I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest. He only does what he sees the Father doing. He came to finish his work. Here's where he only does what he sees the Father doing. He does nothing of his own accord in John 5:19, but only what he sees the Father doing. What the Father does, the Son does likewise. And so I end off by referencing Revelation 3:20. If you've ever wondered why somehow Jesus is seen outside the church knocking on the door, asking to come back in, it's because we start doing ways of church and doing ways of mission that aren't based off Jesus anymore. And we need to be incarnational and recalibrate back to him, just like we see him recalibrating back to the Father and always recalibrating back to Scripture. So that means ReJesusing. It means going back to the founder of the church, Jesus himself. And there's the theology I have for you guys on incarnational mission. Incarnational mission part 2. And we're actually discussing some of these questions today. So this will be a lot more discussion focused, question focused. And I hope you can take these questions even into your quiet time, into other small groups, into your discipleship times, and that they help you make all of the theology we spoke about last time just more tangible. And there's a few postures even within that, couple of categories of how Jesus came and incarnated right there, by which we get the questions for tonight. He came into the world close to us, so he had proximity. The world did not receive him, but he came to his own, so he had presence with people. And for the sake of alliteration, these words all start with P. Powerlessness, presence, proximity, and proclamation. He told them about his Father. And before getting into those 4 categories and 4 Ps, which, by the way, I stole them, come from Jeremy Stevens. He's in the Tampa Underground down in Florida, part of just a very, very incarnational community. Probably the one who I know has incarnated themselves the most. They have dozens and dozens of ministry to dozens and dozens of different types of people because of principles like this. Next, I just want to share a quote before those 4 P's of incarnation. And this is from Hugh Halter. He says, an attractional process focuses on creating a place where people can go to and hear the message of the gospel. The incarnational approach tries to first create a people to which someone can belong so that they can feel or see aspects of the gospel lived out. So in an incarnational approach, if there is an attractional element, it's probably the transformed lives of the people who are now blessing others, forming those friendships, allowing them to belong so they can experience the good news before they even hear the good news. I was mentioning that in my house church this morning. So I invited 4 or 5 neighbors over and tell them, yeah, we get into the word a little bit, have discussion at 11, but just come at noon for lunch too. If you're just come over and socialize with us. And truth be told, if they showed up at 11 though, they would go, well, what is this, a mini concert? Why is someone playing a guitar in the living room? And it would be a little bit unfamiliar for them. So we're always trying to innovate those things. Also from Hugh Halter, like harsh words spoken without tact or a fire burning outside a fireplace, missionality by itself can hurt the cause of Christ more than it helps. This is why missional has an inseparable twin, The word is incarnational. It means to take on flesh. If missional means to go, incarnation is about how you go and what people see as you go. It encompasses your posture, your tone, your motives, and your heart. Incarnation is critical because it will eventually determine whether or not people will want to know you or your God. So if we showed up in my neighborhood and had just an attractional church service and went door to door and tried to pass out communion and sing songs to people, that may be very missional, but it may not be very incarnational to them. So this is what I asked in our house church this morning. Imagine if Jesus were to walk in the room you're in right now and say, "Come on, get up and come with me." Where do you picture him taking you first? Maybe it's someone's home. If so, whose? Maybe it's somewhere you haven't been before. If so, why would Jesus take you there? Maybe it's crossing a ethnic or political barrier of some sort. Maybe it's your neighbors crossing the street. Maybe it's your family. But imagine if Jesus were to walk in the room you're in right now and say, "Come on, get up and come with me." And some people immediately had a name. Said, "Yes, I need to go bless this person. I need to go pray with this coworker." Others were a little more vague, and yeah, I know I usually can find someone to talk to at this restaurant. Um, and others thought they needed to be more first immersed in God before immersed in that tension of going somewhere. And that's awesome too. That's an awesome step of obedience. Just, yeah, I need to go be alone with God. I loved that answer that we got from a few people. So that's where Jesus is going to take them this week. I think that question, when it comes to the proximity, presence, powerlessness, proclamation, they're really all just breaking down that question more. Where is Jesus taking you? So proximity, I'm going to ask 3 questions about proximity, and we'll take a break and discuss. But proximity, we see that in Jesus because it's getting close to the people he's called us to love. And so you probably have to have some frequency and regularity with them to know the faces and the places and to be in their spaces. We say that in the disciple maker's pathway. It could be simple ideas like a weekly porch party, a regular walk that you go on, working from a cafe, or discovering some other natural gathering point and going there. In the pathway, we say, where do you live, work, learn, and play? Those are places where you already have a lot of proximity. So for you guys, where do you exist already? And how do you see that as a place of possible mission? Or how can you begin to be inspired to see it as a place of possible mission? Where do the people you're called to reach gather and connect? And how can you enter those spaces with them on a more regular frequency? A lot of our young professionals share, because it's been a while since young professionals have gotten anyone out to church. And a lot of their coworkers aren't interested in coming to our sacred, isolated gatherings and spaces. um, that's why we've got to go into these third spaces, sports clubs, bars, all of those things, interest groups, affinity groups. In fact, in disciple making movements, they're usually in rural areas. All those disciple making movements, a very, very low percentage of them actually exist in metropolises, in big cities. There's several reasons for that, but most of the expertise says if they're going to break into the cities, it's going to be through affinity groups rather than going village by village. It's going group by group. Presence. Let's touch on some presence questions, and I think these will be the last ones we get through tonight. So leaning in from proximity to presence, it's being around people, it's engaging with them in a meaningful way. In the pathway, this is like our gospel conversations. So it requires intentional questions, conversations, becoming good listeners to people's pain, to their dreams,
and not trying to solve all of their problems or fix them right then and there, but just being present with them. So not having an agenda necessarily. So some ideas that we throw out in the pathway are just pray for people, bless them. That takes a lot of the agenda out of it. Be attentive to them, their names, their stories, what makes them tick. So what are a few good spiritual and or meaningful questions that you like to have in your back pocket when you're engaging with people?